Hello, YouTube. Pastor Jack here. Welcome to my study and welcome to my YouTube channel. First Things First with Pastor Jack. This will be the second in a series on the history of the New Testament. We did two introductory videos, and then about a week ago we did the first session, and we're going to do the second session today. We talked in the first session about the manuscript era and how that that God knew when He sent Jesus, when He did, that He would they would not be able to record Him, that they would not be printing presses made until 1400 years later, and He knew that there would be manuscripts. And I believe that God preserved His Word. He told us in Matthew, and we talked about this all in the first week, but He told us in Matthew's Gospel that in the King James Version it calls it the dot and tittle, but it's actually in the Greek it says the smallest Greek alphabet characters, the smallest parts of it. The old country preachers used to say all the I's and all the T's, and none of that will pass of the law until it's all complete. And so that is the verse that we use to say that God is preserving His Word. And He was telling us there how He was preserving it. He was preserving the part that He actually breathed, the part that He wrote. So what parts did He write? Well, it's pretty simple that He wrote the originals of the Old Testament and the New Testament. He wrote them through His men that He called to do that. And of course, we have none of the originals anymore, but God knew that we wouldn't have the originals for very long because Jesus, again, come, and those were written on pieces of leaves and that they put into scrolls, and God knew they wouldn't last. But He said also in Paul's writings that He writes His law on our hearts, and He writes it on our minds. And so that is how God has preserved His Word. He gave it to the apostles. As far as the New Testament's concerned, they penned it down. We made copies of it. It decayed. There was transcribal errors in the scribes' process of manuscripts, manually writing a script, but God preserved it in our hearts and minds. And when we look at those manuscripts and we see the small variances, I didn't say a small number, there's a large number of variances, but they're small things, that it's easy for God to use what He writes on our heart and mind for us to resolve those issues and know exactly what the Word of God is. And that is how God preserves His Word, through His children. And so we talked about all that in the first episode. Today we're going to be focused on and talking about three things I want to give you the definitions of so you'll understand what they are. You'll hear theologians talking about these things, especially the theologians that gets involved in what we call textual criticism. And it's not being negative towards the text. That's not it at all. It is trying to figure out the text and decide what the original said. And we call that process textual criticism. And they'll throw around words like Textus Receptus, majority text, and critical text, and they'll use those like everybody listening to them knows exactly what they are. And everybody don't know what they are, but they tend to, and they will interchange them. And if you listen close to what they're saying, it'll make sense if you understand what they're talking about. But sometimes, somebody who don't know too much about it starts talking about it, and they interchange the words in places they can't. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But first of all, Textus Receptus. Textus Receptus is called, that's Latin for received text. And back in the late 1400s, early 1500s, Irenaeus, who was a Catholic priest who didn't like being a priest, and so the only other option Catholic priest had once they become priests. If they didn't want to be a priest, they could go into studies and they could become an expert in some kind of field and teach. And so Irenaeus studied Latin. He studied it. He was the leading expert of his day on Latin. He studied Greek. And I don't know that he would be considered a leading expert on Greek, but he was for Latin. And so he decided in the late 1400s to sit down and write, because the printing press had been developed and people were starting to do, and they called them studies. We would call them commentary today. But he was going to take the Vulgate, which was written in Latin, and he was going to sit down and he was going to do his notes for the Vulgate. Well, as he were doing that, he realized how poor of Latin that was used in the Vulgate. The Vulgate had been around now over 1,000 years, and it was written for the common man. And Latin language had changed a lot. You can read the King James Version, and you see how much the English language has changed in 400 years. Can you imagine how much the Latin language had changed? So he decided to revise the Vulgate. In order to do that, he needed some Greek copies. And it just so happened in the city he was in that they had been some people leaving another area of the world in the late 1400s and moved there and brought some Greek manuscripts with him. And he had 5 to start with. Before he finished all his revisions, he ended up with 7, I believe. But so he was taking those Greek manuscripts and revising the Vulgate. So now instead of just making his notes on the Vulgate, he's revising the Vulgate and making notes. Well, as he looked at the few manuscripts he had, Greek manuscripts, he saw some variants in there. So he was trying to decide which, he tried to resolve the variances, and so he ended up writing a Greek revision, looking at the ones he had, which was not many, and try and come up with a new Greek translation. And so, or a writing of the Greek. It wasn't a translation. He was looking at it in Greek and writing in Greek. But, and he finished it in 1516, and he had it published. So his started out to be doing a commentary, we'll say, and ended up revising the Vulgate and the Greek, at least combining the copies he had to make a new Greek writing. He used, when we read his notes that he wrote later in his life, we see that he tried not to change a lot of the Vulgate. He tried to not change it. And if it was a very popular verse, you can imagine if you revise in the King James Version, you're probably going to try to leave John 3:16 alone, right? I mean, because everybody knows it. Well, he tried to do that with the Vulgate, and so he ended up in 1519 revising it again, 1522 and 1527. He ended up revising it in 1535 for the 5th time he revised it. And he didn't think he was writing the Word of God. He knew he was writing a Greek manuscript from 5 or 7 manuscripts. And he would, he revised all those 5. He changed. He would think of a better way to say a word or come up with something. Then Stephanopoulos was a guy that come after him in 1546, 1549, 1550, and 1551. He revised Irenaeus' work, and then Beza come in 1565. He did 2 revisions of it, 1567, 1580, and 1582, and then he did another one in 1588, 1590, and 1598. He did the 17th revision of what we call the Textus Receptus. So there were 17 revisions. Some of those copies, not every one of them, but the guys, the King James translators had various, and we can prove they had at least 4, maybe 5 different copies of the Textus Receptus. And remember, all 17 of them were different. they use those to come up with the King James Version of the Bible. And which one did they use? They used, we know, four or five. We don't know for sure which group had what. They were in different cities, and they were actually doing different parts. And so they got together, put it together, and made what we call the King James Version of the Bible. So that's the Textus Receptus. You can buy copies, they still publish them. I have a couple copies of the Greek New Testament that were written back in those days. I have one by Bose, and they you can get them today, and they're still printed, and they're still, not all of them I don't think are, but a lot of them are still in print, and you can get them on Amazon. If you're interested in getting one of them, if you can read Greek, then you might be interested in having it. Another text that we're going to talk about is called the majority text. And the majority text is not actually, if you try to go to Amazon and buy a copy of the majority text, you're not going to be able to buy it. Majority text is a process for resolving variances. And people that hold to the majority text, basically what they look at the nearly 6,000 Greek manuscripts that we have, and they give them all one vote. So when there's a variance, they look at those 6,000 manuscripts and they decide what number, the largest number that agrees, and whatever that reading of the Greek, then they use that and say that's the majority for that variance. And they resolve each variance looking at all the 6,000 copies and deciding which one has the same reading the most, and that's what they use. So they each get a vote. Each manuscript gets a vote, and the one that has the most votes is the variance to go with. The problem with that is, although it might sound good, like, well, the one that had the most has to be the one that's right. Not necessarily, because of the family trees and we'll talk about that for the last section on this. But all the manuscripts are in families, and they some of them are copied from other copies out of that same family, and so Byzantine is one that we have right now. I think the most manuscripts is the Byzantine family. There's a Western text, and we don't have many copies of that. Then there is the Alexandrian text, and we have quite a few copies of that. And but the majority text don't look to see which one's the oldest. It just says which one has the most readings. Well, just because one had an error and it was copied many times doesn't mean that it was correct. And so the majority text does not make mathematical sense. I worked in a nuclear plant. I was senior reactor operator. Math makes perfect sense to me, and this majority text does not pass the math test. Just because there's more of them does not mean that they are the correct reading. So that's the majority text. And the last is called the critical text. Now, can you go buy a critical text? Well, you can go buy a copy of a Greek Bible, a Greek manuscript that will say it's a critical text. There's not just actually one critical text. Critical text is another method of looking at the manuscripts and resolving variances. And basically, the critical text gives older manuscripts more importance. When they weigh them out and they're looking at this variance and which text says this way and which text says this way, it's not the one that has the most necessarily that wins. If the older texts have it one way, and maybe 3 times as many newer texts has it another way, then they try to look at it and say, which one of these variances answers the other variances? You say, what are you talking about, preacher? Well, let me give you an example. the church went through ages, and in the 800s and 900s, they went through times that there were a large group of people, supposedly in the church. I don't think they were really saved, but they were in the church. Who might would say, I'm not sure Jesus was really God, and I'm not sure he was the Christ. And they would be people in the church, like I would, flare up and say, oh, no, he's part of the Trinity. We have all these things to say he's part of the Trinity. So that flared up a few times during church history, and it had to get resolved. Just like, just like circumcision, flared up with Peter a couple of times, and Paul would have to resolve the issue for him again. So those things happen in humans, and so let's say that we're rocking along, and there've been a lot of good manuscripts in the 200, 300 A.D. range, and they just say Jesus, and then the church is going through one of these times, and there's a scribe that's making a copy, and he makes it say Jesus Christ, where the copy he's copying from just said Jesus. Well, that's explainable. When you look at that, you can say the original probably just said Jesus. But this scribe writing in the 9th century or the 10th century, and the church was going through one of these periods where some people were saying Jesus wasn't the Christ, that explains to me how that scribe wrote down Jesus Christ. He wanted to make sure that nobody misunderstood that this wasn't talking just about any Jesus. It was talking about Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And so it's easy to see that word could have got added pretty easy when the older manuscripts just had Jesus. And so when you're trying to resolve the issue, and you're looking at the critical text, you're looking at all the manuscripts, you're giving the older ones a little more importance, but at the same time, you're looking for the answer to the variant that answers all the reason those variants were put in that form. And what I just explained to you would be one example of that. There's many, many more. But so the critical text, if you Google, you can probably find somebody selling what they're calling the critical text. They use the critical text methodology to make the copy that they made, and it makes perfect sense. I have many copies that would call itself the critical text. There's not actually one; there's many, but the critical text you can buy, and the other thing the critical text does, it looks at the scribe's process, and it considers that. And what I explained to you would be that this scribe's making a copy during a time when the church is having a big question in this area, and the human in him comes out, and he adds the word Christ to Jesus. That's considered the scribe process. And so that's what the critical text does. So the three different terms that we talked about is Textus Receptus. We talked about, and we call that the TR. We talked about the majority text. We call that the MT. And then the critical text, the CT. So I see my time is almost double what it usually is. So I'm going to stop right here. I'll come back tomorrow, and I will do two more, talk about two different verses or two different sections of the Bible. That is the main difference in these three different textual types that we have here, where you can make an informed decision and you can decide which one you're going to follow, which one you think is the best. God bless you. Keep it first things first. I'll see you on the next video.